I'm Stephen Hicks. Our guest today is Robert Lawson, who's the Fuldenweider Chair of Economic Freedom at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Steve.
You're here speaking on the Economic Freedom of the World Index primarily. Give us a brief description of the scope and purpose of that project.
The Economic Freedom of the World Index, which is something I've been involved with since the early 1990s, tries to put a score or a rating index number on how economically free different countries are. And so the idea is to give a number to all the countries in the world to how close they are to the sort of free market ideal.
So what would the major dimensions of the free market ideal be?
Well, basically to do well on this index, you want to have a relatively small government, low taxes and low spending. You want to have secure and sound private property rights, and that includes a good system of justice, contract enforcement, sound money, so low inflation, low tariffs and quotas, and also relatively limited regulations and business regulations.
Okay. And then how do you gather the data for each of these dimensions? And it was 152 countries, I think you mentioned?
152 countries, and we collect data, 43 distinct variables. And the data come from just normal sources, World Bank, IMF. Some of it comes from private organizations like the World Economic Forum in Switzerland or PricewaterhouseCoopers, for example. But most of it's pretty conventional. It's tax rates, it's tariff rates. There are some good data from the World Bank, for example, on how long it takes to start a business, how many procedures you have to go through, and things like that. So the data are all publicly available. I don't make anything up. It's not a beauty contest. As I say, it's not a rating that I create out of thin air. It's basically a data collection exercise.
Mm-hmm. So a follow-up question, something like a degree of taxation, that would be pretty straightforward. It's 15%, say, in Hong Kong, 27% here, 60%, right, and so forth. So you can rank those on a 10-point scale pretty easily. But something like, say, the efficiency of a judicial system, how do you take qualitative stuff like that and turn it into a number?
Yeah, there are a lot of things in both property rights and regulation that you really don't get at with a sort of hard number like you do with tax rates. So we're sort of stuck with using survey-based type data. But there is a really good survey done by the World Economic Forum. It's called an Executive Opinion Survey, and they surveyed tens of thousands of people around the world who are business executives, who are doing business in countries, and they ask them these detailed questions about all kinds of things, but among them are things like how impartial are judges in the country, how hard is it to start a business in your country, how hard is it to hire a worker. And so they're subjective questions, but they're being asked of pretty authoritative people. They're not public opinion polls, for example. So I have a lot of faith in them, and the World Economic Forum's data are really well regarded around the world.
Okay. So you have 40-something variables in 150-something countries, and then you just publish a list. And then, at least in terms of the chart you presented in the lecture today, you had it divided into quartiles, so the top 25%. What are some of the representative countries here in the top quartile?
Sure, yeah. Just for simplicity purposes, we kind of divide the country into groups of 4 groups. The top group is and that's basically your market economies, your sort of Western industrial market economies. It includes certainly the United States. It includes England, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, most of Western Europe are in that sort of top 25%. But it also includes some countries you might not think of. It includes some of the oil countries like United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, because although they're not very politically liberal, they're quite economically free. You can open a business and import and export, and taxes are low and things like that. It also includes a few Eastern European countries like Estonia and most recently the Republic of Georgia that have been reforming very quickly in the post-Soviet times. So those are the countries at the top.
Okay, to go to the other end of the spectrum, the bottom quartile, what are some representative countries there?
Well, the dead last country is Venezuela. As most people know, Venezuela has been on basically a socialist, sort of populist regime now for quite a number of years. But this would include most of the countries where government plays a heavy-handed role in most aspects of lives. A lot of African countries, which are just incredibly tightly regulated. They're not terribly taxed, but they're regulated in an extremely tight way. Zimbabwe is in the bottom 5, I think. It includes countries like Argentina, though, the sort of crony crony type countries, where a small group of aristocratic, sometimes businesses, but aristocratic groups basically control the economy through the political process. So those are the ones in the bottom end, and then in the middle you got a bunch of sort of countries that are sort of a little bit of each.
So some of the countries that are large players that we hear a lot about, where do they stand? For example, Russia, Brazil, China, India. Where do they fall out?
Right. Yeah, the so-called BRICS. Yeah. They actually don't score very well on our index. Brazil. And they're all about the same. They're all roughly speaking around the 100 mark, plus or minus a little bit. So they're well below the halfway point in terms of the index score. And I think it's deserved. I mean, none of these countries are truly liberal market economies. They're all sort of centrally planned corporate economies. They have businesses, but those businesses are operating in an environment of incredible political control. To use one example that I used in class today, China's capital market is 100% government owned. I mean, the entire banking system is owned by the government. So every Chinese business person, small, medium, and large, who wants a loan to start a business or expand a business has to go to a government official for a loan. That's the same as asking for permission from the government, really.
Exactly.
And so those countries really aren't liberal market economies the way you and I think of them.
No, we hear a lot about them, and we hear impressive things about them. Is it that they're starting from a low benchmark, and so their rates of growth are high? Or is it just that these are large countries with, in some cases, 100 million or more population, and so they have a huge economic impact? Or that they've been climbing up in the rankings? Why do we hear so much about them?
Well, it takes an awful lot of work to keep people down. And what China, India, and to a lesser extent Brazil, and to a great extent Russia, what they did for a long, long time was try to keep people down. And so they've all liberalized. I mean, obviously the Soviet Union, Russia is a lot more liberal in its economy today than it was under the Soviet Union. China is vastly more liberal today than it was when it was tightly controlled in say the 70s and 80s. So they've liberalized a lot, and it turns out that just taking your boot off the necks of people a little bit unleashes a lot of creative activity, economic activity. And so I think the growth rates are just a reflection of that little bit of loosening. I think that the problem they're going to have is making the next step. It's one thing to go from relative poverty, $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 per capita or $5,000 per capita. Turn that into 15, or then turn that into 30 or 35 or 45 or 50. I don't think they'll be able to do it. Just the other day, someone asked me about Brazil, and my response was, look, if Brazil can go from $15,000 per capita to $45,000 per capita with a low economic freedom rating, they'll be the first country in history to do it. No country has gotten truly rich, first world rich, without having a lot more economic freedom than Brazil and India and China have. So they've been able to go from being very, very poor to being not so very, very poor.
To put some numbers to it, if you take the top quartile, right, of most economically free countries, what does that translate into GDP rates or average income rates?
Yeah, the top quartile has an average income of about $37,000. So the top 25% of the scores, that's pretty good. I mean, that includes some not so rich countries, but it's on average very good. And it's about $3,000, $4,000 for the bottom group. So there's a huge gradient as you look at the economic freedom scores and you compare those against income. There's a huge gradient that shows that as you get more economic freedom, you get more income. And it's not just income, it's all the other measurable outcomes we have.
Are there any outliers, any countries that are economically free but nonetheless very poor, or going the other way, countries that are very rich but nonetheless are not economically free?
Not in the long run. There are no outliers that I know of in the long run. There are certainly short-run outliers. I mean, I mentioned Georgia, the country of Georgia. I mean, it's terribly poor. The income there is about $5,000 per person. It's never been rich, though, and it's only had anything even close to any degree of economic freedom for about 10 years. And it's just not realistic to expect a country to go from $5,000 to $50,000 in 10 years. It's never going to happen. They've had good growth rates since they've been reforming, 6-8% a year, which is great. But they're a long way from achieving it. So when you look at a static picture, at a point in time, you will see occasional outliers. But there's been no country that's high on our index for any length of time, say 10, 20, 30 years, that has not, become basically a first world country. Mm-hmm. Hong Kong's a classic example. I mean, Hong Kong was devastated after World War II. It was one of the poorest places on planet Earth. People literally starving to death in Hong Kong as a result of the Japanese occupation. Well, today it's the richest country on the planet. So, it happens. It doesn't happen overnight. And people are impatient. So one of the challenges is that when countries reform towards economic freedom and, you don't become rich overnight, that people say, well, wait, you said we were going to be rich. I said, well, no, we're growing at 6% a year. That's really good. Just, right. Be patient.
You also correlated economic freedom with other factors that are not necessarily directly economic, such as life expectancy and so forth. So what is the correlation between economic freedom and life expectancy? How does that play out in your data?
Yeah, well, we like to look at things that are not just sort of monetary in nature. In part, this is to help motivate, because people have trouble understanding what GDP per capita really means, but they know what life expectancy means. So the life expectancy data are really quite interesting. The difference between the top quarter of the scores and the bottom quarter of the countries is about 20 years in life expectancy, and it's a huge difference. I mean,
so as I remember, it was around 80 years in the top quartile and around 60 years in the bottom.
It's roughly speaking 80 years for the countries at the top and 60 for the bottom. And as I like to say with students, that's the difference between getting to know your grandkids and not. I mean, if you die at 60, you see your grandkids born, but you probably don't see much more of them before you go. But if you live to be 80, what a joyous thing it is to see your grandkids grow up, or even see your great-grandkids grow up. So my daughter is 18, and she has a close relationship with two of her great-grandparents. And that's something that most human beings, at least those who don't live in free and prosperous economies, they just simply don't get that.
Right, absolutely. Infant mortality rates would be closely related to that. How does that play out?
Infant mortality, same pattern. I mean, almost all the patterns. Infant mortality rates are much lower in high economic freedom countries. Malaria rates. I mean, it doesn't really matter what you look at. Yeah.
So those are all health issues. How about issues like education, years of education, quality of education, same correlation?
Yeah, absolutely. And most of this is probably driven by income. It's that, economically free countries generate a lot of income, and with that income they invest in education systems, they invest in healthcare systems, they invest in water treatment plants and so on. So it may not be freedom per se, it's the growth and the income that comes from freedom that drives these things, but it's those results are all out there. There is only one thing that's a negative, and that's obesity. It turns out that it looks like people in more economically free countries are more obese than otherwise.
Of course, that's just a few generations of being rich. It might be a learning curve.
Well, I hope so.
Absolutely, right. So far, this is a social science descriptive project, but you do have a strong normative bite, right, to your approach here. You framed the lecture initially in terms of the great debate between Adam Smith and the advocacy of the market economies and Karl Marx advocacy of centralized or communistic societies. So one of your points was that your data settles that debate. How so?
Well, I think it settles the debate. The data are really quite overwhelming. And to a certain extent, that's just a purely positive, descriptive result of the data. If you think things like longer life expectancy and income and less infant mortality, if you think those are good things, I think you're sort of naturally led to a normative conclusion that economic freedom is a good thing. I guess it doesn't necessarily mean that, but that seems to be the natural normative conclusion. I personally have always sort of had that normative conclusion. But one of the really good things about this index is that it's a transparent index, and it's used by people who are opponents of economic freedom as well as proponents of economic freedom. I think the scale that we've created is an accurate reflection of the degree to which countries have economic freedom, and most people recognize it as such, even though people like me who created it are actually kind of normatively in the game, the index itself was put together, I think, in a fair and dispassionate way, and most people agree to that.
So do you see it then as a tool in the ongoing policy debates as well? Or is it hopefully that it will be more of a tool so people will look at the data and shape policy based on what the data show?
Yeah, I think that was the goal all along. The goal all along was to inform our policy debates. And instead of our policy debates or our academic debates being first and foremost ideological debates, the classic debate between Marxists and capitalists, or free market people and socialists, or whatever, instead of those debates being fundamentally ideological, that if we could turn those debates into more of an empirical debate, that maybe we'll learn something. And I think what we're learning, though, is that the capitalist side, if you want to call it that, has the better end of the deal when it comes to the actual evidence.
So it's just a matter of then policymakers and other intellectuals being open to the actual data.
That is the challenge. I mean, you have to, for people who have already formed their views, it's going to be a real challenge, but we do our best.
I'm sure it is all available in print form, but the more accessible form is likely to be online. So where do people go to get the data online?
Our publisher is the Fraser Institute in Canada, and they have a website, and their own website, but they have a special website for us. It's called freetheworld.com, one word, free the world. And on that site, you can actually download the PDF for the entire book. We give it away for free, so I don't get any royalties on this book, I might add. Yeah, I know, right? I'm totally bad at this. You
need a manager.
Exactly. And the database is also available online. And one of the beautiful things about it is our project is totally transparent. All the numbers that we use from all these sources is in the book. And people email me constantly to ask a question about the numbers. And sometimes when I make a mistake, if I transpose a number wrong or something, people out there who are using the index will correct it. And so that's a great part of the project.
Okay, that's scientific methodology and practice right there. Okay, well, thanks very much for being with us today, Professor Lawson. Very illuminating.
Thanks very much.